Hey everybody, today we're going to take a look at how to calculate the effect of an expense ratio on your return over time. So this is something that I see calculated incorrectly a lot of times in a lot of podcasts and blogs and things like that. Let's take like a quick example. Let's say that you have a 10% return. Let's say that this is like a 1-year return. Okay, so you got 10% this year, but let's say that there was a 2% expense ratio in whatever mutual fund that you were invested in. Not ideal, but let's just say that you had a 2% expense ratio, or maybe that's how much you have to pay to whoever is running the fund. That's the expense that they charge. What I hear a lot of people do, which is incorrect, is they say, oh, well, you had a 10% return and then you had a 2% expense, so that means that you had an 8% return for that year. That's not correct, because that actually assumes that the 2% expense ratio was only applied to the amount that grew. So for example, if you have your principal and then you have like the growth for that year, the 10% growth, this calculation would only assume that you took the 2% out of the amount that you made that year. But if you're taking 2% out of your total net assets, then that means that the 2% would need to apply to everything, the principal and to the growth. So you have to make sure you know how that 2% is being applied. If it is only applied to the growth, then yes, this works. But if it's applied to the net assets that you have, then this is not going to quite work. And you'll see that if you use this calculation, it's an okay estimate, but it's actually over the course of a couple of decades, it might mess you up a little bit if you use that estimate. So what's the correct way to do this? Well, let's do the same scenario. Let's pretend that we have a 10% return for 1 year, and then we have to pay a 2% expense to the fund or to the fund manager, or whoever is managing our money. So the easiest way to think about this is that, let's say you started with $1,000 and we're going to get a 10% return. So the way you would do that is you multiply that times 1.10. All right, so this is the return. Now, the way you can calculate the expense, remember this is a 2% expense. So the way that you can think about that is that you're going to keep, it's a 2% expense, so you're going to keep 98% of whatever's in there. All right, so this is going to grow to a certain amount. In this case, you're going to add $100, so you're going to have $1,100 after the year, and you get to keep 98% of that, because the whoever's managing the money is going to take 2% of that value. So you can just multiply that by 0.98. All right, so that's that's how much you'll get to keep. So we can run that calculation here. $1,000 times 1.10 times 0.98. You'll see in this case the return is not an 8% return like we predicted over here. If we go from $1,000 to $1,078, that's actually a 7.8% return. It's lower than the 8% return. And you might say, well, it's pretty close, but over the course of a couple decades, that could make a big difference. So let's see, like, for example, let's make the stakes a little higher. Let's see the difference between running like $100,000 at an 8% return for 30 years versus running $100,000 at a 7.8% return for 30 years. And let's see what the difference is going to be. So that's $100,000, 8% for 30 years. All right, so in one case we'll have about a little over $1 million In the other case, let's run it at the lower return. Yeah, we're going to have about $50,000 less. So it is, sorry, yeah, about $50,000 less. So it is like somewhat significant, especially if your calculations are kind of tight. One way you can do this calculation also, if you want to do it over the course of many years, you can either do it like this and figure out what the annual rate is going to be and then just apply that like I did in this case. Or what you could do is you could have done like $100,000 and then every year it gains 10% for 30 years, and then you're going to have to pay out 2%, so you get to keep 98% every year. So that gets raised to 30. If you know your exponent rules, you know the exponent rules say you can actually do this and just raise it all to the 30th power. It doesn't matter, you're going to get the same number. But you can see that's the same, I should get the same thing here. I hope so at least. So if I run this, 0.98 raised to the 30 power. Yeah, so you get the same number right there. So let's say you want to figure out what your annualized return is going to be without actually running a bunch of numbers. Really what you can do is you can just take your rate and multiply it times how much you're left with after the expense. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you're going to get an 8% return, annual return, and let's say you have a much more reasonable expense ratio, maybe something like 0.20%, so 20 basis points. So what you can think about here is that you're going to keep, 100% minus 0.20% every year over here. So we're going to keep about exactly 99.8% every year. So whenever I want to figure out my actual return each year, I can say, well, each year I'm going to have 108% of what I had the year before. All right, so just 1 plus the rate of return. And then I need to multiply that by how much of it I get to keep. I get to keep 99.8%. So 0.998. Okay. And if I run this in the calculator here, you'll see that you get 1.07784. So that's going to be about a 7.784% return. That's how much you'll actually make after the expense ratio is factored in. Now notice that that's different than if you had just taken 8% and subtracted the 20 basis points. You would have ended up with 7.8%, which is higher than what you actually do get. In this case, it's not a huge difference, and that's because the expense ratio is low. But as we saw before, if this expense ratio is higher, then it's going to make a much bigger difference. It's going to throw your calculations off. Another thing you can do is you can use this to see just how much like a big expense ratio changes your returns. So let's say you have like 100%. Sorry, let's say you have like $100,000, and again, let's say you're going to get like a 10% return. Let's say 7%. Kind of factor inflation in here. Let's say it's about a 7% inflation reduction, factored return. Okay, so we're factoring in inflation. Inflation adjusted, I think is the word I'm looking for. All right, so let's run it with like a 0% expense ratio versus a 1.5% expense ratio. That's pretty high, but maybe you're paying some manager that. And then let's run it versus an index fund expense ratio, something closer to maybe like, let's do it like 10 basis points, something super cheap. Maybe like a total stock market fund or something like that. So we can actually see how this tracks. Let's give it 30 years. All right, so let's say we saved this in our 30s and we're going to try to retire in the 60s. So If we didn't have any expense ratio, then we would just do 100,000 times 1.07 over 30 years. If it has a 1.5 expense ratio, we're going to do 100,000 times 1.07 over 30 years, but then we're also going to only keep 98.5% of our money. Okay, so we're only keeping, because we're having to pay out 1.5%, so we only get to keep 98.5. And then over here with the really small expense ratio, we're going to do 100K. Same calculation, 1.07 to the 30th times. In this case, we're going to keep 99.9% of our money. Let's just kind of see what the difference is going to be. So 100,000 times 1.7 raised to the 30th power. That's if we didn't have any expense ratio at all. So it would grow to about $761,000. Let's do the small expense ratio. So let's do the index fund. So you keep 99.9%. You see, that's pretty good. We're gonna lose about what, $23,000, maybe 22.5 to the fund. Not bad. So we're pretty close. But let's look at the really expensive one. Let's just see how that affects our performance. And again, this is kind of assuming that we're getting the same returns with all of these. So this one's going to be 0.985. Usually when you're dealing with exponents, it will surprise you. So let's see if it surprises us here. Yeah, there you go. That's a pretty big difference. How much is that? This value minus this value. Oops. Well, it's not let me copy. Let's just type it in. All right, so it's about a $250,000 difference, a little more, $277,000. Versus up here, we're looking at like a difference of $23,000, $22,000. Here we're looking at a difference of over $250,000. So that big expense ratio definitely has a big effect on your money, so don't take it lightly.